belonging. Hope everybody is doing all right out there. These are wild times. Take care of yourselves. Check in on people that you love. We are in a mental health crisis in this country, so really be sure that you are checking in on folks and taking time for yourself. And if you're not okay, it's okay to say that and get yourself some help. I am super fired up to have Carter Stepanovsky with us today. Carter, introduce yourselves because I will never do you justice.
Yeah, thank you. I am a Colorado resident. I work in tech, identify as trans non-binary, and I'm really passionate about showing up and normalizing what it means to be trans and non-binary.
All right, so we're going to be talking about conscious leadership. We knew it was great because when we had our first conversation, Carter, we're like, do you want to talk about gender identity? Is that, and you were sort of like, well, yeah, right. Of course, like it informs everything.
Yeah.
So let's start with this idea of conscious leadership.
Yeah.
And what is it? And what is it? And how is it related to inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, for me, conscious leadership is a means of building authentic connections through self-awareness. And gender identity is all about self-awareness. So there's a lot of overlap there for me. And it does very much relate to that authenticity piece.
So, it always comes back to ourselves, doesn't it? It always comes back to like doing work on ourselves.
Yeah.
So as that relates then to leadership and creating, and our focus here in this series is really on workplace, because when we talk about the positive tsunami, right, and ripple effect that has in families and communities, as it relates to being an inclusive leader, connect the dots for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think conscious leadership has enabled me to develop a sense of presence that gives me ownership and space to show up in the world, and especially in how I react. And so it can be a gender identity related dialogue or not. And conscious leadership, I think, allows me to be transparent and take 100% responsibility and really take ownership around my participation and be the resolution. And so that shows up at work for sure. Oh, go ahead.
You just hold.
Okay.
People that watch this series are so used to me doing this.
Good.
You just said so much in like 4 sentences.
Yeah.
Because there was transparency, there was ownership, there was even more. I want you to drill down more, sure. Please. Like, yeah. What does it look like?
So through my work with conscious leadership, which has included some weekend camps or seminars, as well as 2 12-month leadership programs, all focused on conscious leadership, that work has enabled me to peel back the layers around, my own identity, independent of gender, and really bring awareness and recognition of how I show up in the world and where I might feel like I have these sticking points of not being 100% authentic. And so that body of work has helped me, I think, have more ownership over my gender identity. And that shows up in a lot of different ways. And so that's probably the authenticity and transparency part is, and ownership, honestly, of owning how I show up and how I interact with other people.
I am hopeful that there's more focus. It's certainly the focus of the work that we do, particularly with the app, on shifting the focus from impact to intent, from intent to impact, and really having people understand day in, day out interaction, how am I impacting others, right? In the way that I'm responding, in the words that I'm using, in the environments that I'm creating. And so what I'm hearing you say with conscious leadership, it's like that on steroids, in terms of really, really just always exploring and
Mhm.
thinking about, and I'm going to use vulnerability,
Mhm.
um, the vulnerability of showing up in a really authentic way and really being cognizant, consistently cognizant of impact.
Mhm.
Am I,
Yeah,
am I picking up a bit?
yeah, I'm with you. And I would say one thing that I really had to learn, or that I am still very much learning, and I think something that was illuminated to me early on in my journey of conscious leadership is this concept of 100% responsibility. And because of how I was raised and where I was raised and family dynamics and learned patterns, I have a history of taking more than 100% responsibility. And so, one thing I've really learned is actually how to take less responsibility, so that I'm really only owning my own self, my own approval, my own security. And so that's been really, it's obviously, it's going to be a lifetime journey, but that's been really important for me.
Oh, Carter, that's so right, because we hear so often about people not taking enough responsibility,
Mhm.
right? It's not my fault. It's not my, like, sort of deflecting and, oh, it
Mhm.
was because of this or because of that, or that's not what I meant.
Mhm.
And what you're saying is, right, taking too much, taking on other people's
Mhm.
responsibility.
Mhm.
What does that look like? Because I think oftentimes and I love that you unwrapped so many ways, right? Why that's been the case for
Mhm.
you. And I would love to see some sort of sociological study on this, that I'm guessing people from underrepresented underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, that may be the case more often of
Mhm.
taking over responsibility.
Mhm.
So what does it look like to take less responsibility and appropriate responsibility?
Yeah. Um, for me, I really check with myself and um, ask, do I have a full body yes to helping somebody understand my pronouns, or why asking me to do the emotional labor around somebody else's learning may not be appropriate. And so for me, the 100% responsibility around my own kind of, gender identity journey has really been around, what am I taking on, and do I want to take that on right now? And so an example would be, if I'm misgendered, this doesn't really happen right now, but if I'm misgendered picking up a coffee at the coffee shop, I will pause and say, is it important to me to correct this person who I may never see again,
Mm,
or not? And so that's the 100% responsibility. That's just a very quick surface level example of, I probably won't spend the emotional labor to engage in a dialogue right now about pronouns.
mm,
But for someone that maybe I'm working with every day, different circumstances will, I think, build that foundation of, yes, I'm ready to take this on and take um, more than 100% responsibility. But again, it starts with, do I want to do this? Do I have a full body? Yes. And if I do, then I'm willing to take more than 100% responsibility. But really, my work has been around taking less responsibility.
yeah. Well, I think that's the emotional labor part's enormous. And I never want to make assumptions about what people know or don't know in
Mhm.
terms of even like what's emotional labor.
Mhm.
Um, we one of the core things, one of the core reasons we created the app was to take that emotional labor away
Mhm.
from people from underrepresented groups, right? Like we have a whole section on gender and gender neutral pronouns, even breaking down what's the difference between gender and sex,
Mhm.
right? What's the difference between gender identity and gender expression
Mhm.
and gender norms and pronouns, and what are they, why are they important, all of that, so that it's not me coming and saying, Carter, help me understand like what a gender neutral pronoun is, or help me understand, um, somebody says they're gender queer, what does that mean? right? Like, you're like, all right, really? Like, I just want to do my work today. That's, um, I often will talk about my daughter as a person with a disability. And there are days that, and I'm going to quote her, that she's like, I don't owe you shit, right? Because she's so tired of having to, and that comes with all different sorts of privilege. And so thinking about this emotional labor and not taking too much responsibility, then we all have different kinds of privilege, right? Whether it's around, for me, white, cisgender, able-bodied, right? Um, and then thinking about, what do I need to get smarter about? And how do I need to, so then I think about going back to this conscious leadership piece. What am I taking responsibility for day in, day out around my impact? And what do I need to learn? And then what do I need to not take on? I love that, right? Because there are some days that it's like, I just don't want to be your guide in this.
Yes, and I don't want to discourage folks from learning and having curiosity and asking, those that may represent topics or concepts that you don't fully understand. I don't want to discourage that completely. I guess my recommendation there is ask. Don't assume that someone has the emotional labor to engage in that dialogue, but rather, I love when folks say, hey, would you be open to answering a few questions about this? And are you okay if I come back to you and ask, a few more questions? And it's just that curiosity, which is, I think, the opposite of an assumption, that is really refreshing. And so that gives me an opportunity to consent or not.
Right, giving choice. And I think there's I'll say this till I'm blue in the face, that curiosity is an inclusion superpower. And so if we're coming at things instead of assumption, but with curiosity, and then doing that check-in, our recommendation too, Carter, is always come with some base knowledge.
Yes.
Right? Are you more open if somebody's like, here's what I've learned, versus like, Carter, educate me?
Yeah, tell me everything. Absolutely, yes. And coming with the curiosity, coming with a learning mentality, and certainly having done research, because we have access to so much information now. There's really no excuse. I think I would have a very different reaction to someone who has done the research and is hoping to fill in the gaps with some real world perspective from one person who doesn't represent anyone else other than themselves. That's also my stance.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a meaningful engagement. And even still, depending on the circumstances, I may or may not be willing to engage in that dialogue, just depending on, the circumstances.
Right. Like my kids were exhausting this morning. I'm on a deadline.
Exactly. Yeah, real life.
Yeah, life. If you give me, if you would, 3 conscious leadership tools.
Yeah. So 100% responsibility is definitely one of them. Just, I think, pausing and having that check-in of, am I doing more? Am I taking on more than I should? That's the question I ask myself, but maybe for someone else, it's, hey, am I not taking enough responsibility here? So that's one that really.
Okay. So a pause and asking yourself some questions specific to responsibility.
Yes. Yeah.
And is another in there I'm just curious, because it's one that I ask myself, and I don't know if it fits in this framework. It's what's my responsibility in this? Like, what have I done to impact this situation or this person? Or so I'll even sort of pull back in that way when I'm at my best, Carter.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Another one I really love, and it's similar to 100% responsibility, but it's, and you'll notice a lot of these start with a pause. And for me, that's been really helpful with reactivity. We're all emotional human beings. And so having that pause has been really helpful. But another concept would be this idea of above the line or below the line.
Okay.
So am I feeling open? You know, do I have choice and curiosity and trust and playfulness in this situation? Or am I below the line, which is, you know, I'm closed or contracted, and there's blame or shoulds or gossip involved. And so for me, when if I'm in a scenario and there's an opportunity to react and I have that chance to pause, I need to check in. And if I'm below the line, that's okay too. I mean, conscious leadership is not about always being above the line. It's really just about that opportunity to check in and like, where am I and where am I coming from? Um, and even sometimes just having that awareness allows me to shift. Go ahead.
So if I'm below the line, then is my choice to like probably the best choice is to disengage.
Maybe. I think it just depends on the person, and maybe you don't have the choice to disengage, right? Like maybe you're in a situation where you have to be engaged. So for me, just having the awareness of where I'm coming from, I think allows me to show up in a more aware way. And I can even say, hey, I'm really below the line on this.
Mm.
And, you know, and
And so then there's some conversation with your team, right? Understand what's above, excuse me, what's below the line.
Mhm.
That's interesting. So I'm gonna, of course, now I'm gonna have a coughing fit.
Yeah, no worries.
I was on a call, Carter, about 2 weeks ago with the team, and it was with a potential partner, and there was a series of things that took me way below the line, right? And I could not disengage. And what I found myself saying was, I don't really know what to say right now.
Mhm.
Right. And I left it because what I really wanted to say was wildly inappropriate. But that was a way that, but I consciously had checked in with myself, like, I am pissed, right? Like I'm in a bad place right now. But I couldn't disengage.
Right.
Okay. So that was that. Okay. I'm just trying to give
Yeah, totally.
okay.
And then the third one would be this concept of fact versus story. Um, yeah. And so for me, that's been really, um, it's been really illuminating to be able to parse apart in a situation. What do I know to be true? What is a fact? And then where am I making assumptions or filling in the gaps with my own narrative? And that's a story. And so having that recognition of the distinction between fact and story, I think also allows me to be more aware and more present and more authentic in a situation. And I also find that it gives me an opportunity to own my story and say, hey, I have this narrative that X, Y, and Z is true, and having an opportunity to confirm or clarify whether that is the case. Because I have noticed a pattern when I don't clarify the narrative and I assume the story is true, then that leads to all sorts of miscommunications or lost trust. You know, the list there is probably limitless.
Well, and I think about both positive and negative bias.
Mhm.
That I think sometimes, we think about story and we think about fact versus sometimes we're filling in a story with positives
Mhm.
that may not be earned.
Fair, yes. Yeah, that's a
Um,
good point.
uh, well, yeah, no, it always comes back to ourselves, doesn't it? Okay, so is there anything that you wish, and by the way, y'all, Carter wrote a really great piece out on Medium, and I will put that in the comments after, because that when I read that, Carter, and you were talking about like being able to show up as authentically you in the workplace and what that meant when when we're thinking about gender identity, what are 3 things that you wish workplaces or leaders or coworkers would do? I don't know why 3 is the number today,
Sure.
Carter. 3
Yeah.
is the number. You can
All
have more,
good.
you can have more or less.
No, I'll take it. It's a good exercise in distilling to maybe what feels the most important. So I'll try. I think so. The question is 3 things that a workplace can do. Okay. I think make space for folks beyond the binary, and that is, a really broad, maybe a cheap way for me to take more than 3, but that includes benefits, it includes applications, it includes bathrooms, and nomenclature in the workplace. I think just there's a huge opportunity for us to be more inclusive. And one of the ways that we can be more inclusive around gender identity is to think beyond the binary. And then I think, so that's the first is think about services and paperwork and, all of the things that show up in a workplace that may be exclusionary. And then secondly, I guess this is maybe the biggest one is ask what folks need. And I think that goes beyond gender identity. That goes for everyone. It's, anybody who might need an accommodation or who doesn't necessarily fit into the norm, whatever that is. My ask would be to just ask and not assume, and that goes for everything from pronouns to services to and beyond.
So does that question look, and I'm on a personal crusade to get rid of the word accommodations.
Okay, yeah,
I only say that because it comes from like, oh, we need
yeah,
to accommodate you. And
yes,
right, like, and so that language, and I get it from the legal, blah, 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 blah.
yeah,
I want us to find better language because accommodation it feels just so othering to me.
yeah. That's fair. Yeah. What would you
I
prefer?
don't know. And that's what we all, that's
Yeah,
what I've been trying to figure out. What inclusions could
yeah,
we make? And I don't think that's perfect language. And y'all who are watching this, I would love, let's as a community come up with better
yeah.
language for
Yeah,
that.
let's crowdsource it because I'm sure there's a lot of opinions there,
Yeah.
and that's a great point about the othering of accommodations. Yeah,
Right. Like if I'm asking you, like, how can I accommodate you, Carter?
right.
Like that's
Yeah.
just such a like centered in right. So
Yeah. And so
um
maybe, yeah, if given the opportunity to reword, I would say maybe, ask what support folks need.
there we
Um,
go. Yep.
yeah. And so, yeah, so thank you for checking me on that.
Oh no,
Uh,
that truly is me just recently thinking about that language. And I don't know if it really hit me when I was watching, and if you haven't watched Crip Camp, it's amazing.
okay.
So Crip Camp, it's the story of these, it's really this camp that ended up producing all of these amazing disability rights advocates. And we have the ADA because of them, like all of these things. And at the end, when the ADA is finally passed, all this has happened. And Judith Heumann, who's amazing, and we should all know about her, but of course that history isn't taught to us.
Mm.
She said, I'm tired of being grateful for a bathroom that I can use. Right. And that's where I started thinking about this idea of like the language of accommodation.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
love let's crowdsource it.
Yeah. And
Um,
I look forward to the day that I'm not grateful for finding a bathroom too. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That's
Yep.
like the bare minimum breadcrumbs of
Yeah.
um okay, so
So yeah,
what
so the
what
first one
support?
was, yeah, it was like kind of support and services and awareness that it extends beyond the binary. The
Yep.
second is asking and giving folks a voice. And then I think third, it comes down to leadership, and that needs to, that inclusivity and belonging needs to start at the top, and it needs to be infused in a culture, so that it's just normalized.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a token person in a culture that like is, and so I would love for leadership teams to be more representative of our populations. Yeah. And so, yeah, those are not necessarily in order, but those would be the three.
Yeah. Here's one, and if you would, as we're wrapping up here, I have, I think about the fact that, I was sitting with family and gender neutral pronouns came up. And people are like, I don't like, what if I make a mistake? Blah, 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 blah. All this stuff. I'm say sorry, them, move on.
Mhm.
Right. Or sorry, she, move on. Right. And I just think that's so fundamental because I have seen this with people with physical disabilities, people who are gender non-binary, that there is a politeness that can happen because of fear of saying or doing the wrong thing.
Mhm.
And I feel like polite is the opposite of inclusive.
Mm.
And not the opposite. It's a barrier to inclusion. If I'm just in a very superficial way,
Mhm.
polite or avoiding.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if you would, I would love to just have this conversation about their mistakes are going to be made around everything about inclusion. And I think that loops us back to conscious leadership.
Mhm. Yeah.
And 100% responsibility.
Yeah. I have a story there that the root there is actually fear. Folks don't want to be wrong.
Mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm.
and I think there's a fear of messing up, and what does that mean about me? And that's just my personal take on it. And so, because I think you can still be polite and inclusive, you know.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I agree. Everything you said about if you do mess up, what's the best way to move on? It's absolutely just quick acknowledgement, restate, whatever the correction may be, and then move on. Because as soon as it becomes bigger than that, it actually becomes about you. Yeah. And so if you were to, mistakenly misgender me and then fumble and stumble and blah, blah,
Oh my
make it
gosh,
this big
Carter, I'm so
thing. Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Blah. Oh.
It's actually about placating your mistake. Right. And so, and then it no longer becomes about my pronouns and recognizing me as I want to be recognized. And so I couldn't agree more with, hey, quick correction, keep moving.
Yeah, and just this idea, y'all, we're all, whether it's around pronouns or, who knows what, like, again, I talk about this all, I screw up all the time, right? And learn and move on and acknowledge, learn, move on. And let's just that fear, right? That if we can get rid of that root of fear and come 100% responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And above the line actually really fits in there too. Like if you can be above the line about a mistake, then you have, trust and playfulness and curiosity and this openness rather than, oh, I should have done it differently and I'm going to blame myself and I feel overwhelmed. And so, yeah, I think above and below the line comes in there too, which is about taking 100% responsibility. But that concept, I think, of above and below can visualize that experience.
Are there a couple of resources around conscious leadership that you in particular find of value?
Yeah, so this all came out of an organization called the Conscious Leadership Group. So that's conscious.is, I think is their website.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of resources there, and their book, the 15 Conscious Commitments, I think, and hopefully I'm representing that correctly, is a great resource. And then, here in Colorado, there's a great facilitator and educator, Sue Halbronger, at heysue.com. And that's who I've worked with. And she does camps and has a number of resources. You can even just subscribe to her blog or newsletter and get a lot of really valuable information. So there are practitioners who have taken this body of work and bring it to the world. So I would recommend those two in particular.
And then other than our app, good
Yeah.
resources around gender and gender identity?
Ooh, well, I guess there's one. So there's a website called transstudent.edu, and they have this concept of the gender unicorn, which I think it actually relates a lot to what you were saying around what is the difference between gender expression versus gender identity. So that is something that I like because it's a visualization that folks can really understand the differences of, how do you feel versus how do you show up in the world.
Yep.
So that's top of mind.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have talked about everything from the power of the pause,
Hmm.
100% responsibility, above the line, below the line, fact versus story, making space, asking about support. And then I took us on a little tangent around accommodations.
Yeah, no, it's good.
And just so much. Leave us with one last truth bomb, if you would.
Yeah, I think I would encourage everyone to look inward. This is all about the work that you can do, we can do, that I'm doing around self-awareness to have better and more authentic connections. And so I think if it's of interest, it starts with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I knew this was going to be phenomenal. And thank you so much. I've got like so many wheels turning. Y'all go, and if you just search by Carter's name, that Medium post will come up, or just put in Carter Stepanovsky and Medium, and it will. And I would say that should give everybody sort of this aspirational idea of what their workplaces can be like, to be really, really inclusive. So Carter, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
And everybody, we will see you next week on Everyday Inclusion and Belonging. Cheers.